From United Nations headquarters in New York, this is World Chronicle, an unedited interview program about major global issues. Here now to introduce our guest is the host of today's World Chronicle.
I'm Michael Littlejohns, and this is World Chronicle. All too often on this program, we deal with apparently intractable problems. For a change, today we'll be looking at an area where there's been some progress: education in the Asia-Pacific region. Here, primary school enrollment has increased and adult literacy has grown. In most parts of the Asia-Pacific area, funds available for basic education have nearly doubled. On the downside, the gender gap in education persists in South Asia in particular. What lessons can be drawn from the region's experience? Our guest today is an expert in education in the region. He's Victor Ordóñez, Director of UNESCO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Joining me to talk with Mr. Ordóñez are Betsy Pizik of the Washington Times and Judy Lessing of Radio New Zealand. Mr. Ordóñez, welcome to World Chronicle.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Mr. Ordóñez, let's not get bogged down too much in numbers, but has UNESCO achieved its goals in the region at this date?
Well, the countries around the Asia-Pacific have in the past 2 years been taking a very hard look at exactly how much progress they've made this past decade, towards the end of this past century. And the report cards are in, and the results, frankly, are mixed. UNESCO and the world community did set rather ambitious goals to reach by the year 2000, and not all of them, frankly, have been reached. Some countries have done better than others. And the trouble with looking at figures or statistics in their totality as summary figures is that they tend to disguise the disparities within. In Asia, for example, we have some countries that have done remarkably well in achieving education for all goals. But on the other hand, we have some countries, such as those in South Asia, where not much progress has been observed. What's more interesting is that the recent research has told us that now that we have a good look and a good picture not only of how the country is doing as a whole, but how the countries are doing within the different provinces or regions of their country, we are recognizing that the disparity is not just between countries, but also within. We see
between cities and rural
areas, between the ethnic minorities and the majorities, between the girls and the boys. And we see that the educationally rich are becoming richer and the educationally poor are becoming poorer, and that's a very disturbing trend.
We've spoken in the introduction about the continuing gender gap. This is, I presume, a result of cultural and religious difficulties.
Yes, it's also economic. Very often the family, the working family, needs somebody to stay home and take care of the younger children, and they often ask the eldest daughter to do that. Poverty is the source of many of these difficulties, and that together with the cultural and religious backgrounds of these communities makes the problem even more difficult to deal with.
You spoke about education for all. In fact, what you're talking about as regards education for all means primary education for all, does it?
Actually,
5 years of primary schooling or something?
That is probably the main vehicle for education for all. But I think the recent thinking is that we can no longer talk about education and limit it to schooling. There are far too many alternative avenues for learning that are around us now that we ought to take advantage of. In addition, some of these communities that are traditionally not reached by schooling will never be reached if we continue to impose upon them those patterns of education that the mainstream is used to, but which do not at all suit their lifestyles. So we have to constantly reach out and seek other ways of delivering education and meeting their learning needs in the non-formal context, in the distance education context, so that now when we talk about education for all, we see primary schooling as just one of 6 pillars. Early childhood education is another very important pillar. I spoke about adult literacy as another important pillar. Learning of skills in non-school settings is another pillar, and so on.
Can you go into some of those details, actually? That sounds very interesting. When you talk about non-traditional methods of reaching people, particularly in terms of early education, how do you go about this? I'm thinking rural settings or geographically isolated areas, or even those who don't fit into the traditional definition of all when you talk about education for all, girls, and so on. Are there innovations here?
There are, and I would imagine there are as many interesting examples as there are types of unreached populations. If we talk about ethnic minorities, many of them nomadic, we have to talk about not a school in terms of bricks and mortar. We have, for example, a couple of projects. One of them we call the floating blackboards. We put teachers and blackboards on actual ships of nomadic seafaring peoples and accompany them on their fishing expeditions and make sure they follow at least a minimum learning curriculum in the context of their lifestyles. So we
who does the teaching then?
We have two, depends on which country we're talking about. I know that in the southern Philippines what they do is they take young women from the communities themselves, take them away for about 6 months to a year and give them a crash course in educating children, and then have them go and handle these courses. And when they come to land for certain times of the year when the fish is not good, they go into regular schools and have some kind of credentialing equivalency program with regular teachers. So this is one of many examples. I know in Ethiopia, for example, to take a different part of the world, the number of children in school exceeds the number, is exceeded by the number of children outside of school. So if we were to talk about education for all in a country like Ethiopia, it means doubling the number of schools, doubling the number of teachers, doubling the educational budget, which is just physically impossible. So another way has to be found. And now they're looking at community learning centers where parents, older children, all come to a place where the young who need to learn a skill or a talent or need a certain health message to be transmitted to them converge, and learning takes place in very unstructured ways. But learning does take place, and I think what they're working on now is a way to calibrate and credential that kind of learning so that it can be seen as the equivalent of some kind of primary schooling.
Some of the information that we've looked at before we all sat down at this table suggests that more and more children are indeed going to school, like the numbers are going up. But just having children sitting in a classroom setting doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be learning very much. How do you measure what it is that they're getting out of all of this?
Well, I think that's a question that we're all struggling with. There are really two questions you're asking. The first one is, how do we know that what we're teaching is going to be useful for the future? And then second of all, how are we going to measure the success with which we communicate that to the children? It is true, when we talk about education for all, people now add the first word to qualify it. They talk about quality education for all, because schooling, as we know, is not learning necessarily. There are sad cases of children after 4 years of schooling who can hardly read a book in many countries.
Including the United States.
Including the United States, very true. But I think more and more we're recognizing that education really shouldn't be pursued for its own sake. It's not enough to say they know how to read and they know how to write and we've done our jobs. If we look at the history of education in the past century, we can say that we've been very good at communicating knowledge and advancing the frontiers of science and technology. But we've been really terrible at teaching our children and our adults other things, such as how to live together without killing each other in ethnic wars and violence, or how to handle such endemic problems as HIV, AIDS, and so forth. So education is not just, to read and write as such. Education is to be able to equip the next generation with the skills, the attitudes, the values, to come to grips with the terrible problems which are threatening the very survival of this planet. Economic and environmental degradation is taking place. And if children aren't aware of the value of their planet, even if they can read and write, we're basically not educating them. And it's these areas, I think, that are really worth exploring a little more.
Has there been an effort, though, to define minimal acceptable standards? I mean, in terms of the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic, is there an effort to actually ascertain how successful some of these programs are?
Yes, countries are very jealous of their prerogative in that regard. They like to say that in our country, this is what the field is, what they call the minimum learning content. And this is what we will measure our kids by. There are, of course, universal elements in that. 2 plus 2 equals 4 in any culture, and the ability to communicate a sentence or a thought systematically and clearly is necessary in any culture. But beyond that, the content of their civic education or their history, etc., countries like to define what that is. But having defined it, they don't always take the next step, which is what you've asked about, namely, how do you measure the extent to which this is communicated and absorbed by the students? We have in about 37 countries now an experiment ongoing in trying to measure the extent to which this is taking place. We're trying to see whether, in fact, all the effort that goes into education does pay off, that students, in fact, do learn at the end of the day. And unfortunately, the results are not very encouraging. From the little we've seen, we're not much more effective at communicating basic knowledge today than we were 10 years ago. In spite of the fact we have better books, we try harder, teachers are better trained. My suspicion is because we don't recognize that the student is not a standing object. He is also an evolving being. And therefore what worked 10 years ago for a student may not necessarily work for today's students. So much has changed that we don't realize that the way we learned when we were in school is not the way children of today learn. We were used to reading books, doing linear analysis, and students today are bombarded by MTV images and the deluge of the internet, and they don't learn in lockstep logical sequence. They learn by getting an impression or an instinct on the basis of a deluge of ideas and images, and come to an instinct as to what the thing is. But if we're still teaching them in the old lockstep way, and they're learning in entirely different ways from movies, from MTV, from the internet, then our schools are very soon going to become obsolete. They will be fortresses of the past rather than pioneers for the future, which they're supposed to be in the first place.
But you're talking about some concepts which mean that you must have a television set, or more importantly, you talk about the internet, somebody has to have access to computers. But we're also talking about a region which, although of course it does have television and there are people with computers, there are whole societies that have never seen either. So,
yes, yes.
You know, there's a disconnect somewhere.
And there's a growing polarity, in fact, between those who are the technologically haves and the technologically have-nots. But I think I referred to the way children think as influenced by technology as merely a symptom rather than the cause. In other words, children do think differently, whether they are rural or urban. And the teachers must recognize and understand and learn to think that way if they're to make an impact. Now, as far as the digital divide is concerned, we at UNESCO and the other organizations as well are looking more and more to see how we can use technology, not so much to increase the gap, but to sort of narrow it. My sense is that in the short run, it's almost inevitable that those who have are going to be so far advanced of those who have not, just in terms of access to information. But I think in the long run, that gap will narrow. I remember my younger days when hand calculators first came out, expensive American brands. We in the Philippines, only the rich kids could buy them. Now they're giving them away in gasoline stations. And so the calculator is no longer a divide between the rich and the poor. Well, one day I think computers will be that way. And then the gap will narrow. But it's our concern that in the meantime, in the short run, technology does not become an instrument that creates a greater polarization and tension between those who have and those who have not.
This is World Chronicle. Our guest is Victor Ordóñez, Director of UNESCO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Ordóñez, which countries of the region are doing the best job of improving education standards, pouring most money and effort into the projects?
Well, perhaps I could answer them on a country-by-country basis, but it's probably makes more sense to discuss the sub-regions within the Asia and the Pacific in respect of specific education for all dimensions. Let me take one, early childhood education. There are countries in Southeast Asia, such as the Philippines is just beginning, but such as Thailand, which is far more advanced, and even Vietnam, which is not quite as rich as the other two, where more and more children below the age of 6 are receiving some form of early childhood care and education. The rise in numbers has been spectacular. The enrollment has almost doubled in the past few years. On the other hand, you have the struggling economies in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the Stans, and the Transcaucasus, where in their transition from a centrally controlled economy to a market economy, in their transition from having passively received all the finances they needed for education to now having to find ways to raise it, enrollment in preschools and kindergartens has dropped very dramatically to less than half of the original levels. So you have a situation in early childhood where more and more countries of the world are recognizing its importance and therefore putting more and more attention into it. But other areas where, because of the change of the economic climate, it isn't working.
So in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, these so-called STAN states didn't have good educational programs?
They had very good enrollment numbers. The preschools, every child of 3, 4, and 5 was in some kind of daycare or preschool center in the so-called bad old days. Nowadays they're having a hard time keeping that going because their economies are adjusting and they're looking at other priorities, and it's very difficult to keep the social fabric intact.
You know, every government, everyone is in favor of education. It's not a divisive issue, but I'm wondering just how much cooperation and commitment that you're getting from international organizations and from the governments themselves. Is financing up? Is there a financial commitment? I see that donations from governments have been rising at least through '95, but what's the current situation on that? Are there sufficient resources?
Well, 10 years ago when we tried to bring basic education back into the center of the priority agendas of governments and donors, there were pledges all over to actually give more resources to this. That in fact happened. But after the first 5 years it started to level off, and my sense is that people realize that the solutions are not purely financial. Finances are of course necessary, but where governments do not manifest the strong resolve to do something about it, international assistance tends to be inefficiently used, to put it kindly.
It's diplomatic.
On the other hand, unless governments realize that that building their base, their citizenship, is an investment not only in education but also an investment in productivity and peace and order and social harmony down the road, then unless they realize that, then they will perpetually be distracted by the urgent and neglect the important. You know, paying a teacher's salary doesn't sound very exciting or very urgent. Whereas if you have an economic crisis, the stock market falls, of course it would, yes. But if there was some national emergency, then all the resources go there. But a lot of attention to solving national emergencies tend to use resources for short-term solutions. Whereas putting resources into education, you're really building not only long-term solutions, but long-term prevention of the problems that you're dealing with. And it's this kind of message that governments are more and more now beginning to listen to.
Could I go back to something that Michael mentioned in the beginning, because I'm afraid that we're going to kind of put it over there and say, well, we've been there, done that, and it's the gender gap. What are the figures in the Asia-Pacific region for boys in school and girls in school?
Well, the ratios, I cannot generalize, but in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, it's almost equal. It does not mean to say there's no gender problem, because even when the numbers are equal, the girls and the boys are not necessarily treated equally. Well, that's a big problem. But in areas like South Asia, in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, you have a situation where there are almost 2 boys to every girl. It's almost that bad in some of these countries. It's improving a little bit now, so that the gender gap is improving. So instead of 7 out of 10 being boys, it's now 6 out of 10 being boys and 4 being girls. But it's still far from satisfactory. And I think the world's attention has been called to this many times. And over the years, I think all countries, even governments of the countries I referred to, realize that this must be addressed, and addressed seriously. Money has been poured into this problem, and projects have been launched to do something about this. But reviewing our recent statistics, we see that the impact of all of this activity, all of this money, all of these projects on the gender gap has been far from satisfactory. It's almost like the statistics haven't moved very much. And one wonders, where did all this money go? What happened to all the effort?
So what would you do next if it's...
What would you
it doesn't seem to... If that isn't working, what might?
Well, we looked at the projects in greater detail, and we realized that it is true many projects didn't make an impact, but there were a few that did. And I think part of the international dialogue has to be sharing with each other what are the factors and projects and activities that did make an impact. Just one example. A very expensive solution was to give parents of girls a subsidy to encourage them to send their girls to school. That was expensive and it worked in a number of places, but the minute the subsidy stopped, girls stopped going to school. And we weren't even sure where the money was going in the first place. So that was one project that we felt maybe shouldn't be encouraged on a national scale. First of all, it was obviously a temporary short-run thing. Another project, the opposite example, we found out that just naturally parents will never send their daughters to a school where there are no female teachers. Where the teachers are all male, they just don't trust their daughters in that school. Introducing female teachers in the school suddenly brought the statistics up. So a small program of encouraging more females to be teachers has worked wonders in a country like Nepal, for example. And so we think we know where the answers are. It's just we haven't sufficiently aired them out and given them the proper attention they've deserved. And this is why I think international conferences, for all the inefficiencies that they sometimes seem to generate, do serve the vital function of sharing best practices and things that work. And people who are serious about tackling these problems have an opportunity to recognize that these problems do have solutions after all.
Mr. Ordonez, how does your region compare with other regions in the developing world, Africa, for example, Latin America, in terms of educational advancement?
Well, Latin America educationally is a more established and older system than many Asian countries. But in terms of the progress in the past 10 years, I think the Asian region in general, except for perhaps South Asia, has made the most progress. You can tell this in the early childhood area, where the greatest growths have been in Asia, and to some extent in adult literacy, where the two biggest countries of our region, which are also the two biggest countries of the world, China and India, have launched massive literacy programs. Every day when the sun sets on India, there are 4 million volunteer workers that go out into the early evenings, into the homes in villages to provide literacy programs.
This is adult literacy.
Adult literacy, and it's had a marvelous effect. So I can say that the region did not start out as the most educated region in the world, by far, no. But it has made, I think, the most progress in the recent decade.
In your region specifically, are you finding that education is used as a de facto political or ethnic weapon, in a sense, that education opportunities are focused among certain groups or among the boys or among other? Is this something that you can
It's a very complex issue,
address?
and it's interesting you raise it, because it is true. Any public service does have a political flavor to it. A very specific evidence of that is the choice of the medium of instruction. In terms of language? In terms of language, yes. So you have countries which insist on one national language as a medium of instruction in the entire country, regardless of whether it is a foreign tongue to that particular population or not. In other countries, they're not as threatened by that and encourage the teaching of the mother tongue or the regional lingua franca as a way of doing that. But it's not so much a explicit but an implicit result of politics when you have countries or sections better represented by politicians being better served. The politicians have children in college, therefore they like to favor funding for college-level education. The politicians come from the urban areas, and therefore they like to favor schools in the urban areas, and so forth. And that's why the disenfranchised tend to become the unreached.
How do you keep the momentum going? You've had 10 years of education for all, mixed results. What's next?
Well, I think this year we're seeing a little renewal of the enthusiasm for basic education because, for one thing, we have this treasure of information that we never had before. We have the assessment reports of 181 countries that have given us, for the first time in history, a comprehensive picture of how they're doing. For another thing, the past 10 years have brought so many fundamental changes that if education doesn't recognize this, as I said, education will fall by the wayside. We have the technological revolution that is fundamentally changing the way people learn and think and do. And for another thing, we have these huge problems. The world continues to deteriorate. We're not going to have a planet for the generations after us if we don't do something about changing the way we treat our planet. And we have continuing ethnic and international violence, even domestic violence. And if education doesn't address those things won't go away. And so there is a greater motivation than ever to recognize the value and the promise of education as a tool that can bring us what all of us want: peace, development, and a planet that survives.
Mr. Ordonez, we have only a few seconds left. Does UNESCO recommend an optimum percentage of national budgets that should be spent on education?
In the past, we have always thought that a number like 6% of GNP would be a good target to work for. Most countries have not come even close to that. But the difficulty with talking budgets is that people calculate budgets in different ways. For example, the amount of money spent on media and informal education has now exceeded the amount of money spent on the schooling system. But I would like to think that money spent on informal education is just as much a part of the education enterprise as schooling.
On that note, we have to leave it. Mr. Ordonez, that's all the time we have. Thank you for being with us on this edition of World Chronicle. Our guest has been Victor Ordonez, Director of UNESCO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. He was interviewed by Betsy Pizik of the Washington Times and Julie Lessing of Radio New Zealand. I'm Michael Littlejohns. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to be with us for the next edition of World Chronicle.
Transcripts of the program may be obtained free of charge by sending a stamped, self-addressed envelope to World Chronicle, United Nations, Room S827, New York, New York 10017. World Chronicle is broadcast worldwide and features guests whose work is concerned with major global issues. This program is a public affairs presentation of this station from United Nations Radio and Television.